Tēnā koutou katoa. This is one of the Kauwhau preaching videos, and this time we're focusing on the lection for the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Te rā tapu te kaumawaru o te wā no iho. And in this one, we just have 5 verses from the start of Romans chapter 9. Now, I need to give you a little warning here and an encouragement to go to the commentary resources that you've been sent. Romans chapter 9 is a very complicated chapter, and it's very easy for us to read it with the lenses that we've inherited from hearing other people talk about it without giving attention to what it actually says. I'm just going to highlight one thing. The New Living Translation has a very nice translation of verse 4, talking about Israel. It says, "They are the people of Israel, chosen to be God's adopted children." And that helps us to see the parallel between the way in which Israel are brought into God's family, just in the same way that the Gentiles are, the non-Jewish people. And so we're being invited here to see these two things in terms of similarity, I think, rather than difference or replacement. And that's probably my biggest thing here. I just want to caution you against this idea that Paul is somehow saying, well, Israel are now out and other people are in, and that Israel, we're getting in by doing works or by keeping God's law, and the Gentiles are now brought in to God's family by a different way, because he's emphasizing that Israel were actually brought into God's family in the same way. They were invited in as adoptees. They were being adopted in out of God's grace, not because of anything they'd done. They're being brought in unmerited. And that's exactly the same as the way Paul is portraying Gentiles, most of us. We're being brought in without favor, without merit, without earning our way or working our way in. So the significant thing here is that Paul is addressing this question of these people were entrusted with God's mission, welcomed into God's family, and yet the majority seem to have not quite got this, or at least there's certainly a historic sense in which the people of Israel, in Paul's view, have not actually managed to fulfill the task they've been given. They've not managed to succeed in their mission. And I think the main thing that's being put forward here, and what Paul is saying, is that this by no means means that there's no hope. It just means that, and what Paul later on, the New Living Translation has the words misdirected zeal. They're seeking to carry out God's mission, but they've just missed the significance of God's Messiah, that's Jesus Christ, and his place in that mission. And so as a consequence, they're heading in the wrong direction, but this is not as disastrous as it might at first seem, because God is able to show mercy to whomever he wants. Now, Paul is also saying some very hard things later in the chapter about God could not show mercy to people. Now, I don't think that's the right place to get bogged down with in preaching from those first 5 verses. Instead, we need to recognize there's something here about whakapapa that connects to God's promises. I wonder if you've noticed the way that Paul speaks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those 3 patriarchs. We call them the fathers of the Israelite, the Jewish faith. And Paul is also talking about those people who are descendants of them when he's writing, and saying that they still have some kind of special status involved here. Now, we see this play out at a practical level. The children of Christians are often Christian themselves. And in fact, theologically, we would say that they're included in God's promises in particular ways. But I think there's something beyond that, which is that God intends for things to work this way. He makes promises that work through whakapapa. And so the whakapapa of the Jewish people means that they're still, in a sense, have a very privileged position in God's story and in God's promises. And so do we, as the descendants. If we're descendants of, like me, of Christian parents, we have a very special place in God's promises. So I would pick out, in preaching on this, I would really pick out the way in which whakapapa gives a special place in God's story, a special place in God's promises. And our expectation ought to be that those who are descended from Christians, who recognize Jesus Christ as Israel's Messiah, they've been given a place in God's promises that's different from those who are outside. That's really what Paul's talking about here, because in some sense it seems a little bit unfair. Like how can most Maori have some sort of whakapapa back to Christianity, but there are other countries where that's not the case. And But I think Paul is trying to place the emphasis here. He defends God and said, hey, it's up to God to do whatever he wants to. But he's also really talking about the place of privilege that in this case the Jewish people have, because they're in God's story and God's promises in particular ways. I think it's also possible for us then to draw out from that and say, we too, many of us, are in God's story in a particular way that gives us hope for our children, and also means that when we're reaching out to our brothers and sisters who are Maori, we can say they've got a whakapapa in the faith and God's promises. And maybe like Paul, we can just find a longing to see them return to faith. I wonder if you notice that in verse 2, my heart is filled with bitter sorrow and unending grief for my people, my Jewish brothers and sisters. What I'm hoping is that in preaching from this passage, you can encourage your listeners to also actually find a genuine and worthwhile bitter sorrow and unending grief for our Maori brothers and sisters. If you are Samoan, for your Samoan brothers and sisters. If you are Tongan, for your Tongan brothers and sisters who have turned away from the faith. If you are Indian, if you are Chinese, whoever, Pākehā. The point here is to feel a sense of solidarity with those to whom you have a shared whakapapa. And instead of feeling like, oh, I'm better than them, to long for them to have what you've got. This is what we should try and imitate here from Paul. Paul sees that some of his relations, his close and extended relations, are far from God. He longs for them to come back. Can you develop that same sense, but also that sense of confidence and optimism that says our Maori people are within God's story now, within God's promises. And so we can reach out to them with grief that they're far away, but also with expectation that God is able to bring them back. Now, the following week, it'll move into part of Romans chapter 10, but I wonder if I can just finish by, and you might be able to finish this way too in your preaching. The very start of chapter 10, Paul says, dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. I know what enthusiasm they have for God, but it is misdirected zeal. And I wonder if we can contextualize that for our own setting and say, we all have relations. We all have people who are part of our own, whatever our people and cultural group is. We can say we know people within our own people more broadly, the Maori people, the Samoan, the Pākehā people, whatever it is, we can say we know people within that who have misdirected zeal, and we'd love them to find the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think that's the message to get across, a sense of solidarity, of longing, including grief, but also of optimism and hope that God can bring them back and they have a place in God's story and promises. Tēnā tātou katoa.